Okay, it's Black August, and we're going to talk about Michelle Alexander and her book, The New Jim Crow. And what I said I was going to do, because I didn't have the time and the energy to devote to going over an entire documentary, like Lee said he was going to do with 13th, since I can't do that, I'm going to go after The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander in order to fight against this propaganda that's polluting the mind of the American people and leading us down the wrong path in terms of our policy choices. So we're going to start off with the preface of this book. She writes, "This book is not for everyone. I have a specific audience in mind, people who care deeply about racial justice, but who, for any number of reasons, do not yet appreciate the magnitude of the crisis faced by communities of color as a result of mass incarceration." So she's already told us at the very beginning that she's not writing to the general public, and she's not writing to people of different ideological positions. That's a big problem for me. The books that I want to write and the books that I want to read generally about factual matters, about policy, should be written for everybody. They should be written for people who know a lot about the issue, for people who don't know a lot about the issue, for people who are socialist leaning, and for people who are right wing. Because if the issue is important, and if you're telling the damn truth, then it ought to apply equally to everybody. So what she's basically doing here is telling us that she's writing propaganda. She's writing propaganda specifically for people who already care about racial justice, people who are receptive to her ideas, but aren't yet motivated enough to do something about it. So what she's going to do is try to use this book to activate those people, to get them involved, specifically in the way that she wants them to be. So I'm going to say this book's propaganda, just from reading, the first two sentences of the preface. Now, what I said I was going to do with this job that I've given myself, this challenge, is in order to evaluate the truthfulness of the whole work, we're going to randomly pick parts of the book. All right, so because we don't have time to do the entire book, what I did was say, how many pages are in the book altogether? It ends on page 384 in the ebook version that I'm using, and it starts about on page 11. So what I did is to get random pages, I used Stata. So I numbered everything, or I set up 384 pages, observations, and then I said label those 1 through 384. And then I got rid of the first 10. So now I have a list, you can imagine like a spreadsheet, in which the first row is labeled 11 and the last row is labeled 384. Now, computers can't generate random numbers, they generate pseudo-random numbers. So in order to prove to you basically that I'm using good random numbers, I went and got the Powerball for August 2nd, which I think we would all agree is a random number. It's physically generated, not by a computer, if Powerball's honest. So I used that number, which was 1165546369618, and I used that as the seed for the Stata's random number generator, the Mersenne Twister, 64-bit. A lot of fancy stuff there, right? I cut off the last digit because that was too many digits. So that was how I started off. So now what we did was we assigned a random number to each one of the pages from 11 to 384. Then we sort it, and we keep only 1, 2, 3, and 4. So now we've randomly selected 4 pages from the book. So I know what all 4 pages of those are, but I'm only going to show you the first one, and then we're going to do the next one the next 3 weeks from now. So we got page 110. So in my ebook here, page 110, the new heading was Poor Excuse. And this is about so-called pretext searches. Pretext searches are an idea of the illegitimacy that if a police officer pulls you over for a traffic violation, then they shouldn't also be, that if a police officer pulled you over for a traffic violation because they had something else that they wanted to see was going on with you, then that's just wrong, totally wrong. So let's see, I've got some notes here I've written. This is selections from the book itself. Michelle Alexander writes, Wren and Brown, both of whom were African American, were stopped by plainclothes officers in an unmarked vehicle in June 1993. So she's telling us first off that the suspects were black and that the car was unmarked. Now that is true. Both of those facts are true. But why is she mentioning those two things? Because her narrative is that blacks are always the victim. What she didn't point out was that one of the officers, the main officer, was Hispanic and therefore an ethnic or racial minority, presumably also a disadvantaged group. And I think, although I can't prove it, that the other officer was black. When I looked up his last name, all I got on Facebook and various other sources were black people. So I'm pretty sure that one officer was black and the other officer was Hispanic. Now, it doesn't invalidate her arguments. It doesn't mean that she's wrong, but it does mean that she's selectively giving us information. Now, she said that their vehicle was unmarked. The police vehicle was an unmarked vehicle, and it was. What she didn't mention was that the suspects were in a brand new, expensive vehicle that had temp tags. And if you've ever dealt with criminal stuff, you know that temp tags are something to look out for. I know of a case in which some people were robbing a store and they took a temp tag and they covered up their license plate. Why? Because they don't want to see people. They don't want people to see their real license plate when they're leaving the scene of a crime. So it's just like one more thing that makes the cop think that something might be up. She then writes, the police admitted to stopping Wren and Brown because they wanted to investigate them for imagined drug crimes, even though they did not have probable cause or reasonable suspicion that such crimes had been committed. So what did the officers actually say? So she says that they admitted to stopping them because they wanted to investigate them. Now, what Officer Soto testified in court was that the recent model Pathfinder with temp tags was stopped at a stop sign, and it had been stopped there for more than 20 seconds. Also, the two occupants were looking down at their laps while they were stopped at the stop sign. And keep in mind, this is like 1993, so this is an area before you were texting. They're just hanging out at the stop sign staring at their lap. What are they doing? I don't know, but it made the police suspicious. At that point, he decided to investigate why they were stopped. So the cops did a U-turn, came around, started following these guys. And they also noticed that they had turned right without signaling and that they were driving at an unreasonable speed. So this was the traffic stuff. These were the offenses that actually allowed them to pull the people over. So they caught up with them at a red light. Officer Soto exited his car, walked up to the window of the Pathfinder, and when he looked through the window, he says that he saw a clear plastic bag of what appeared to be crack cocaine being held by the driver. So at that point, they open up the vehicle and arrest both of the guys. Now, I think they found 3 different types of drugs, including 100 grams of crack cocaine. So they were definitely drug dealing, as long as we can trust the police in terms of their testimony and that they didn't plant these drugs. But that's always the case. That doesn't apply to this particular scenario. So Alexander says, lacking actual evidence of criminal activity, the officers decided to stop them on a pretext, the traffic violation. The officers testified that the driver failed to use his turn signal and accelerated abruptly. Okay, that happened. Although the officers weren't really interested in the traffic violation, they stopped the pair anyway because they had a hunch that they might be drug criminals. It turned out they were right. So she has to admit that they were right. Their hunch was correct. All right, so the idea is that they're just going around pulling over every vehicle being driven by young black guys because they think that they might find drugs in the car. What did the judge think? Because these guys were convicted in district court. What did the judge think? Judge Johnson concluded that the police conduct was appropriate. Need I point out that Judge Norma Holloway Johnson was the first African American woman to serve as a district court chief judge, appointed by Jim Acaldo. peanut farmer. So I'm not really, this isn't looking too good. This is just stuff that she didn't tell us. Why didn't she tell us that the officers involved were minorities as well, that the judge was black and didn't see a problem? It doesn't prove that her argument's wrong. It just, we're going to leave out anything that might contradict it. So this is something I'm going to read to you that I found in the appellate brief. What do you have to say about this so-called hunch that she doesn't like? There is, of course, nothing impermissible about an officer's having a subjective hunch that an individual whom the officer would ordinarily stop for a lesser crime may be involved in some greater crime, and acting to protect himself based on that hunch when making the stop. The officer runs into trouble under the Fourth Amendment only when he makes a stop that he would not ordinarily make, absent that hunch. So the people at the appellate level are signing off on this too, right? Now this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. It went to the Supreme Court because this idea, these pretextual things, had been going on at lower levels, and some people were interpreting it saying that it shouldn't be happening. Now the Supreme Court decided to hear it because they wanted to end this bullshit. Okay, the Supreme Court absolutely settled this issue that Michelle Alexander is bringing up in her book as one more piece of the, new Jim Crow and the war on black people. They took it because they wanted to settle the issue. How did they rule? 9-0. 9-0. Now you know that some of the members of the Supreme Court were liberal, right? In 1996, when this case was being heard, 9-0, nothing, no support for this view. Scalia is the one who wrote the opinion. He said, instead of asking whether the individual officer had the proper state of mind, the petitioners would have us ask, in effect, whether it is plausible to believe that the officer had the proper state of mind. Instead of asking whether the officer had it, should we believe whether it was plausible to believe that they had the proper state of mind? The petitioners use as an extraordinary factor in this case, okay, so the idea is that there are so many traffic laws out there that the police could pull you over for any of them. So they've created discretion as to who they can pull over or not pull over. Let's just jump to the end here. Here, the district court found that the officers had probable cause to believe that the petitioners had violated the traffic code. They turned right without a signal. They were speeding. That rendered the stop reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. The evidence thereby discovered was admissible. So for the Supreme Court, this is so simple. This is absolutely so simple. They saw them turn right without using the signal. Therefore, they did a stop. Therefore, when they saw the drugs, it was admissible evidence. So the only way that Michelle Alexander can build this up as part of her, not conspiracy theory, but part of this huge societal control over blacks, is if she ignores the most basic interpretation, the most basic one, which is they broke the traffic law, they got pulled over, they saw the drugs, that's it. And then also, in order to build up the idea that it's social control against blacks, she has to leave out the fact that the judge, who I'm sure was very, very conscious of her race and the plight of black people in the United States. I mean, think about the judge. She was probably upset that these guys were selling drugs within, I don't know, was it 1,000 feet of a school? They got hit with selling the drugs at a school, okay, because they had it right next to a school. So that was an additional aggravating factor in this crime. That was also left out by Michelle Alexander. So instead of saying, you know, why are these two young black guys selling drugs near a school, she said, how dare the cops pull them over for a traffic offense that, you know, probably everyone agrees that they did commit. All right, well, that's pretty much going to wrap this up. The main takeaways from this are that she is selectively giving us only the facts about the case that support the view that she's trying to propose, and she already admitted in the preface that she's doing that specifically because she's only appealing to a certain group of people. If you've got any comments, please let me know. I'm hoping that next time we get something more data oriented, where she makes like a specific claim about, facts in the world rather than one specific case. This kind of stuff is not my forte, and I've tried to research it carefully. It's why it took so long for me to get the video up. But I'm going to adhere to the challenge I gave myself, which is whatever pages I get, that's what I have to deal with. Okay, thanks for your time.